He didn't betray me with another woman. He betrayed me with the part of himself he kept hidden his entire life. Grace lived in a house that looked like it belonged in a painting. A brick cottage tucked away in the quiet suburban folds of southwest London. Ivy climbed the chimney, the windows were dressed in lace. And inside, the warmth of a vintage fireplace met the scent of fresh lavender polish. It was the kind of home people imagined when they said, ideal family life. She was 38, a freelance interior designer with a love for symmetry and muted palettes. Her home was her canvas. The furniture was curated with care, nothing loud, everything purposeful. 2 velvet armchairs flanked the fireplace. A grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner. Sunday roasts were sacred. Her children's laughter often echoed through the hallways, softening the silence like sugar in tea. Her husband, Thomas, was the quiet sort, thoughtful, dependable, a project manager at a mid-sized architectural firm. He never raised his voice, rarely missed a parent-teacher conference, and always folded his socks in neat little rolls. Grace believed in him the way people believe in bridges. They may creak in the wind, but they never fall, or so she thought. Their life was not glamorous, but it had the kind of elegance Grace had always dreamed of. When she married Thomas, she imagined them growing old in that very house, arguing over crossword puzzles, sipping tea on cold mornings, surrounded by photos of grandchildren. That was the future she painted, stroke by stroke, each year anchoring the illusion further. But illusions have cracks. It began with something so ordinary it almost passed unnoticed. A distance, not physical, but something more elusive. Thomas had started avoiding intimacy. At first, he blamed work stress, budget cuts, a difficult client, deadlines. Grace believed him. She rubbed his shoulders while he stared into the fire. She made his favorite stews. She offered space. But space became silence. And silence, she learned, can be deafening. They stopped kissing goodnight. Conversations became functional. Schedules. Bills. The children's appointments. When she tried to initiate closeness, he responded with a tight smile and a distant gaze. She asked once, softly, "Are you okay?" "Just tired," he replied, eyes on his phone. He started working late more often. His phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket, locked, notifications turned off. Grace didn't want to be the suspicious wife. That wasn't her. She believed in privacy, in trust, but the seed had been planted. One evening, as he showered, she picked up his phone. The lock screen demanded a code. She tried his birthday. It failed. Her birthday, no luck. Their wedding anniversary, still wrong. That night, she didn't sleep. It was easy to brush it off. He's just stressed. Men are like that sometimes. It's a phase. Maybe he's ashamed of burnout or professional failure. Maybe he doesn't want to burden her. But then came the glance. Their neighbor, Simon, had just moved in 2 doors down. Divorced, early 40s, the sort of man who wore knit sweaters in spring and always had jazz playing in the background. He waved to Grace every morning while watering his plants. Nothing unusual, until Thomas started waving back. And not just waving, watching. Their conversations grew oddly animated. Quick glances turned into longer ones. Smiles lingered too long. Grace noticed, but said nothing. What could she say? One afternoon, Grace returned early from a client meeting. She heard hushed voices in the living room. Thomas and Simon were laughing. Nothing overt, nothing scandalous, but the tone felt intimate. Too soft, too private. When she entered, both men looked up too quickly. Thomas coughed and stood, as if startled. Simon smiled politely and excused himself. Grace asked, "What was he doing here?" Thomas said, "Just borrowing the drill." That evening, he deleted messages from his phone. Grace saw it. The reflection in the hallway mirror caught the flick of his finger swiping conversations into the void. "Who was that?" she asked from the doorway. "Work chat. Just clearing clutter." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It stopped halfway, like a light bulb dimming mid-flicker. Grace nodded. She didn't push, Because a part of her didn't want the answer. Because some truths, once spoken, can never be unheard. That night, she sat by the fire long after everyone had gone to bed. She looked around her perfect house, the curated furniture, the scented candles, the framed family photos, and felt like a stranger in her own life. The perfection she had designed, the home she had shaped, now felt like a museum of something long dead. Still, she lit the candles. Still, she made Sunday roast. Still, she tucked the children in and folded Thomas's shirts. Because sometimes, we maintain the illusion not out of denial, but out of duty. And Grace was dutiful, loyal, steady, but beneath her calm surface, something had begun to stir. A question she couldn't silence. Not, is he cheating? But, why does this feel like the end of something I didn't even know had begun? And as the fireplace crackled beside her velvet armchair, she whispered the words to herself, tasting their quiet devastation. I think I'm losing someone who was never truly mine to begin with. Grace had forgiven him, but the forgiveness sat on her chest like a stone that never lifted. Not even in sleep, especially not in sleep, there was a silence between them that had learned how to smile. Thomas would kiss her on the cheek when he left for work. Grace would wave from the front step, wearing the same warm expression she'd always worn. But inside, there was a draft in her soul, like a window left cracked in the dead of winter. And she kept coming back to that message. I wish you could hold me tonight like before. It was the way the words were chosen. Intimate, yearning, not lustful, but familiar, the kind of sentence you wrote when the affair wasn't just physical. She never asked him again. Not directly. What would she even say? That she had seen one line of a conversation she was never meant to witness. That she was starting to recognize the cologne worn by their neighbor 2 doors down. Grace started paying attention differently. She watched Thomas when he interacted with people. She noticed how his posture stiffened when Robert, the neighbor, came by to borrow hedge clippers. She noted the subtle tension in Thomas's jaw, the way his hand hovered near his pocket as if guarding his phone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had forgiven him for a woman he never named. And yet it might have never been a woman at all. One evening, she hosted a small dinner for their circle of neighbors. The fireplace glowed softly, the food was warm and familiar, and laughter filled the room like fog over the Thames. Robert was there. He sat directly across from Thomas. And that's when she saw it. Not a touch, not even a word, but a glance, a tiny flicker that passed between them when no one else was looking. It was the kind of glance you only recognized if you knew what betrayal looked like from the inside out. After everyone had left, and the children were tucked in, Grace sat on the edge of the tub while Thomas brushed his teeth. You never told me who she was, she said, her voice casual, like commenting on the weather. He paused, spat into the sink. Does it matter? He said, not turning around. It matters now. Still, he didn't face her. Why are we digging this up again? Grace stood, walked to the door, but before she left, she added, because you buried it in shallow ground. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she opened her laptop and began drafting the first episode of a podcast. She called it, Grace Notes, What Forgiveness Leaves Behind. The first episode was raw, unfiltered. She didn't name Thomas. She didn't even say what he did. She just spoke of what it meant to live beside someone you once trusted. And how forgiveness wasn't an eraser, just a highlighter in a darker shade. She uploaded it, closed the laptop, and went to make breakfast as if nothing had changed. But everything was changing. Grace just hadn't told him yet. She had forgiven Thomas, but now Grace was haunted by a question that refused to die. Who had she forgiven? The message from L never left her mind. And now, every glance, every late-night excuse, every awkward silence when Robert walked past their garden gate began to echo louder. But it wasn't Robert. It was Simon. Simon, the quiet man who lived just beyond the hedge. The one who smiled politely and waved from his kitchen window every morning as Grace poured her tea. The same Simon who offered to fix their front fence when the windstorm blew it over last spring. The man whose laughter was soft but whose eyes never quite met hers. She had thought Thomas's affair was behind them, with a nameless woman. A passing sin, but this was different. This was intimate, rooted, and familiar in a way that made her feel like a guest in her own marriage. Grace didn't scream, she didn't confront, she did what years of betrayal taught women like her to do: observe. Late one night, while Thomas was in the shower, she took his phone from the nightstand. Her fingers trembled. The passcode hadn't changed. She scrolled. Nothing. Then, she found the Vault app. A disguised folder of innocuous appearance. But once opened, it told another story. Screenshots of conversations. Photos. Some were of Thomas. Some were of Simon. Some were of them together. And it was the captions beneath the photos that finally broke something in Grace. Miss this. You made today bearable. Counting the hours until next time. She placed the phone down gently. Like a piece of china she no longer had use for. She walked to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, and whispered, "Now I know." The next day, she planted a tracking app on his phone. It synced to her tablet. She never opened it in front of him. She barely looked at him at all. A week later, Thomas said he had an evening work meeting. Grace nodded. Of course. When the notification buzzed, she opened the app. His location: Simon's driveway. He didn't even park discreetly. That night, she didn't sleep, she didn't cry, she listened to their old vinyls. Sipping red wine, one glass after another until the edges of the pane blurred. She remembered the woman, Allison, the colleague, who had once sent Thomas a selfie on a Sunday morning. Grace had let herself believe that Allison was the woman. It had made sense. It had made the betrayal easier to categorize. But now, she understood. Allison was a decoy, a smokescreen, a female name to give to a wife, just in case she ever asked. Thomas had always planned this. Not the affair itself, but the deception, the illusion of a straight man's mistake, palatable to a society that forgives a husband who slips with a woman. But how does a wife process being the beard? How does she mourn a marriage when the lie wasn't just about who he loved, but who he truly was? Grace sat in her study the next morning, the sunlight dull through the frosted windows. She recorded her second podcast episode. "There are betrayals that break your heart," she said softly, "and then there are those that rewrite your entire history." She spoke not just of the affair, but of the years she had spent creating a home, a life, a version of truth that was never real. Her voice cracked once, when she said, "The hardest part is realizing he didn't cheat on me. He simply chose to be honest with someone else." She ended the episode in silence. Just a long, quiet fade. The same kind of silence she now lived in. And in that silence, Grace began to plan not revenge, but revelation. Truth, she decided, would not be served with fire. It would be served with light. Grace waited until the children were asleep and the house quieted into its usual evening hum, a low creak from the old pipes. The gentle crackle of the fire. The whisper of wind brushing against the narrow windows. She had lit the fire herself. Something Thomas usually did, but tonight, she wanted the room warm in her own way. The flames glowed low and steady in the hearth, casting soft orange shadows across the velvet arms of the wingback chairs. Thomas came in from the kitchen with a cup of tea, his routine as rehearsed as always. But when he saw her sitting upright with a folder in her lap, something in his gait faltered. "Can we talk?" Grace asked, her voice level. Thomas hesitated, then nodded and sat opposite her. The table between them, the silence was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hush. She slid the folder across the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed thread of messages. His messages. To Simon. Thomas stared, then slowly picked it up. She didn't speak. She waited. His shoulders fell. His hand clenched the page just slightly at the corner. "I never meant for it to happen like this," he said. Grace tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like me hurting you. Me hiding. You didn't just hurt me, Thomas. You rewrote our marriage like a script only you knew the ending of." He looked up, eyes wet but not yet crying. "I didn't cheat to find someone new. I cheated to find the part of me I had to kill to be yours. That broke something inside her. Not a crash, not even a crack, just a hollow echo. She folded her hands in her lap. So you were never really mine. That's not fair. I loved you, I still do, but not in the way I loved you, she said, and now that I know, I can't unknow. Thomas dropped his head into his hands. A sob escaped him, low and guttural. Grace stood up and walked to the fireplace. She didn't look back when she asked, "If I had known years ago, would I have ever had a choice?" Thomas didn't answer, and in his silence, Grace finally found hers. She turned and left the room. Not storming out, not collapsing, just leaving. Later that night, she recorded her third podcast episode. "We always ask why they lied," she said quietly, "but we rarely ask why they never trusted us with the truth." That episode went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because every word felt like it had been lived by someone else. Somewhere else, in some quiet room filled with ghosts and velvet chairs. Grace didn't name him. She didn't need to. Truth, she had learned, carries its own name, and it echoes. Grace signed the papers without ceremony. No lawyers breathing fire across polished oak tables. No shouting in courthouses, just two people at a kitchen counter. Initials scribbled beside paragraphs written by others. Ending something they'd built without ever truly knowing what it was. The house remained hers, though it didn't feel like it anymore. The velvet chairs. The old piano Thomas once tried to learn. The dent in the hallway from where he dropped their first crib frame. It was all memory now. Not hers. Just echoes. He moved out the next morning. No suitcase. Just a backpack. He said goodbye to the children with a practiced warmth. Promising weekends and park days and all the rituals that divorced fathers attempt to turn into scaffolding. Grace watched from the window. Unseen, unblinking, not angry, not anymore, just aware. She didn't change the locks, didn't burn the photos. Instead, she ordered a microphone. 3 weeks later, her podcast launched. Not the woman he needed. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse, she told stories, not just hers, but fragments she gathered from messages listeners sent her. Women who'd married men hiding from themselves. Men who loved but never lived truthfully. People who stayed too long in narratives they didn't write. Her first few episodes trickled into the void. Then, in a quiet surge, they caught fire. Thousands listened, then millions. She was invited to speak on BBC Radio. Her Spotify Wrapped for the year placed her in the top 1% of most followed new creators. But what stayed with her weren't the charts. It was the handwritten letter she received from a 67-year-old woman in Sussex. "Your voice gave me permission to grieve a marriage that never existed." Grace read that letter aloud in episode 10. She cried, not for herself, but for all the women who were told that silence was strength. That endurance was virtue. She didn't date, not yet. Her world wasn't a wound. It was a renovation site. The kids adjusted faster than she expected. Maybe because she never painted Thomas as the villain. Maybe because, in some twisted way, children always knew what adults pretend not to. She spoke kindly of their father. She allowed his name to be said at the table. But in private, on her velvet chair by the fire, she peeled back her own layers. That December, on a day powdered with London snow, she received a message from Thomas. It simply read, "I wish I'd told you earlier. But I was too afraid to lose what we had, even if it wasn't real." She stared at the message for a long while, then closed her phone. That night, she recorded one final monologue before the holidays. "I didn't lose a husband. I lost 12 years of reading a story I was never allowed to choose." She paused, but maybe that's what survival looks like. Not burning it all down, but planting something new in the ashes. The fire beside her crackled. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel cold, she felt hers. Her story, her name, her ending.